Welcome everyone to this afternoon's event. My name is John Friedman. I'm the chair of the economics department, and the economics department is hosting this together with the Watson Institute and the Rhodes Center. And so let me just kind of up front say thank you to Ali Batten and all the staff here at the Rhodes Center and the Watson Institute who really helped pull this together. We are here to learn from David Leonhardt. David is a reporter at the New York Times. He started out as an economics reporter, and then he eventually ended up writing a quite prominent column called Economic Scene, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. And then since then, he's taken a tour through, I think, some of the most interesting posts in the world of journalism. He was the bureau chief for the New York Times in Washington, D.C. He was the founding editor of a section of the New York Times called the Upshot, which I really think is the kind of premier data journalism outfit to this day. And then since about 2020, he's been the lead editor of The Morning, which is the New York Times daily newsletter, which I've heard, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that this is the most widely read piece of written English language that is produced on a daily basis. So. Okay, so you know, David is obviously incredibly impressive with what he's accomplished in journalism, but you know, the thing that for me has really always stood out, I've had the privilege to get to know David over the years, is that he's just outstanding at combining the insights from you know, some of the data in whatever he's thinking about, he'll show you some of that today, with a broader perspective, right? And I think this reflects the fact that you know, he actually had his roots as an applied math concentrator at Yale. I mean, you know, think how much more impressive he would have been if he'd been applied math concentrator here at Brown. And then, you know, from these insights, David is just one of the clearest people I've ever seen in terms of distilling these ideas back for people to listen to and understand. You know, this is, again, from having worked with David on some of my papers, like I learn a lot from talking to him about my papers. I listen to the way he describes my papers, and I take that in as a way to think about how to be clearer in as a communicator. And you know, he's really one of the rare journalists who I just find I'm learning from every single time I talk with him. So he's here today to talk about his recent book. And for the large amount of writing he's done in his career, this is actually the first book that David has written. And it's, you know, as you'll see, it's, you know, really a story of the causes and consequences of the trend over the last half century or more of declining living standards in the US, and trying to understand that kind of through the history of the US economy. So the way we're gonna, the rest of the session is gonna go is that David's gonna talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then Jeff Colgan, who's the director of the Rhodes Center, as well as the Climate Solutions Lab here at Washington, and a professor in the political science department, is going to then kind of lead a conversation first between the two of them, just Jeff and David, and then with the rest of the audience as well. And so in the hopes that the slides stay up on the screen for more than 15 seconds at a time, it's really my pleasure to introduce David Leonhardt.
Thank you, John. What a nice introduction that was. Tell me if you need me moving or anything. It's a great pleasure to be here for multiple reasons. This book came out in October, and I did the part of the book tour where I went on TV and I did podcasts and I did the things that sell books, which are great, and I highly recommend if you write a book, do the things that are going to sell books. I had a bunch of invitations to appear on campuses, and I sort of pushed those invitations back into this semester so I could focus on the other part of it in the window between when my book came out and the end of the year. And I have to say, I enjoyed the first part of my book tour, but I enjoy the second part more because I get to go to audiences like this, and my presentation, I will confess, is a little nerdier than the presentation I give in other places. This is really a book of stories. It's as much a book of history as it is of anything else. It's a book of stories of people who you've heard of, like A. Philip Randolph and Dwight Eisenhower and RFK, the first one, not Junior, whom I argue their full significance is not appreciated. But it's also a book of stories of people who you may not have heard of, like Grace Hopper, a pioneering computer scientist, and Anne Gorsuch, although if you pause on her last name, you may recognize you notice parts of it, or Paul Hoffman. And so it's very much a book of stories, but what I'm going to show you today is really the core of my political and economic argument through charts, and invite discussion and criticism and all that good stuff. And it's a pleasure to be in places like this for a couple reasons. One, John was very kind in how he described my relationship with him and with other academics, but I couldn't do what I do without people like John, and John in particular. I am often taking this path-breaking work that academics do, and I'm translating it for those of us who are not academics or are not academics in that field. And so I'm very grateful to the faculty at places like Brown and at Brown in particular, and having a chance to come back here and just say that and say thank you is really a nice part of this. And a second thing I was just saying to Jeff as we were walking over, I live in Bethesda, Maryland, and recently my wife said to me, our kids go to a big public high school, and recently my wife said to me, I noticed, and this wasn't about my visit, she said, I noticed the kids in our community who go to Brown, I really like them. And I was just saying this to Jeff on the way over. I didn't even know we would have a graduate of Walt Whitman High School in the audience, but we have at least one. So it's also nice specifically to be here at Brown, which is a place that I feel very warmly toward. So let me dig in, and then we're going to talk about it, and then I know we're going to open it up to all of you. And I always say, when we open it up, feel free to ask me things about the book. Feel free to tell me things you disagree with in the book or agree with. Also, feel free to ask about things that have nothing to do with the book. I'm a representative of the New York Times. I've heard occasionally people have complaints they want to issue about the New York Times. I'm here to hear them if you have them, or hear about the state of the media or what's going on in the world or the presidential election or really anything you want. This is the first chart that appears in my book, or a version of it. This is a version that appeared in the New York Times. I was saying before that I really rely on academic researchers for much of what I do. This comes from Ann Case and Angus Deaton, two professors at Princeton. I was doing this talk at Princeton last week, and Ann and Angus were sitting in the front row when I did it. In many ways, my book is an attempt to solve the mystery of this chart. I do not know that you will see a more alarming chart than this. This is the life expectancy of every rich country in the world. We haven't left out any rich countries. You could obviously change the definition of rich countries and have more lines or fewer lines in there, but this is a widely used definition. And what you can see in this line is that in 1980, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. If you look really closely, you can see it was maybe a little bit below average, but it was certainly in the range of normal. So it's not like there's something inherent about the United States that means we must have a different life expectancy than every other rich country in the world. So you're looking at all of Western Europe there, you're looking at Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, etc. And as you can see, starting at about 1980, our life expectancy started growing substantially more slowly, not only than most other rich countries in the world, but than every other rich country in the world. And by the early part of the 21st century, we had the lowest life expectancy of any rich country in the world, and today it's not even that close. The version of this chart in my book starts in 1960, so you can see that between 1960 and 1980, our life expectancy was actually increasing at a rate quite similar to those other countries. So this is a recent phenomenon. Whether you say the slowness starts in 1984 maybe, or 1978, it's somewhere around the late 70s or early 1980s. For all of the statistics that we come across in daily life, to me, it's hard to think of a more important measure of living standards than this. How long are people alive in our country? And so in a basic way, what I would argue is we need to figure out as Americans in why and in what ways are we doing things that are working less well than every other rich country in the world. And so when you go one level below this, and by the way, you can very much see COVID on there, right? And we're worse than almost any other country there. Actually, some of the Western European countries that are grayed out have as big a decline as we do. But you can also see that if we stopped this story before COVID, this is not predominantly a COVID story, right? This was true before COVID. This isn't a predominantly an anything story. It's not just a COVID story. It's not just an opioid story. It's not just a gun story. It's not just a traffic fatality story. It involves all of those things, but it's bigger than any one of them. So if we now deconstruct this to look at college graduates, and by that I mean people who have a four-year college degree, and non-graduates, we notice something interesting. This is a slightly different statistic. This looks at people's life expectancy after they turn 25, because at birth, obviously, we can't know whether someone's going to be a college graduate or not. But you're basically looking at the same thing. Add 25 to all those numbers on there. So look at that line. Look at the general slope of that line for college graduates. It actually looks pretty similar to a lot of those other countries, right? It's still rising. It's still rising for people like us in this room. It fell during COVID. It'll rebound now that COVID has receded. It's the trends for people who do not have a four-year college degree that are just so dark. And so again, look at that last dot before COVID. Life expectancy actually fell in the 2000 teens for Americans who don't have a four-year college degree. That should not happen in an advanced society. I will go further. It almost never happens outside of a pandemic or a terrible war. It is deeply unusual historically. And I think it's a sign, and I'm generally an optimist, I think it's a sign of something that really is not working in American society. So what is that thing? And that is very much why I wrote this book and what I wanted to try to explain. If you read the newspaper today, sometimes even my own newspaper, you'll see people trying to figure out, why aren't Americans happier about the economy given how great the economy is? Well, that's a nuanced question, but I think the first answer is the economy's not great. And just because the unemployment rate is low and we've had pretty good growth for a little while, that's not the same thing as saying that we have a healthy economy that works for most people. Can you see this? Is it big enough? So obviously, what you saw on that last chart, really dark trends for people without four-year college degree, for most working class Americans, for most low-income Americans, that isn't the only way we can see those trends. We can also see it in the economic data. So this is looking at percentage change in income. The lines at the top are the rich and the very, very rich. The dark line in the middle is what our GDP has been growing at. And basically the message of this chart is, if you're very rich, your income increases have outpaced economic growth. And if you're merely affluent, they have tracked with economic growth. And if you're anywhere in the bottom 90%, your income growth has been slower than economic growth. You aren't getting what might be called your fair share of the growing pie. We can see this in all kinds of other data. This is looking at what has happened to the pay of very top executives. Again, this is percentage change. We start them all at the same place. The middle line is GDP, and the bottom line is median family income. I think we're all familiar at this point with the right half of this chart, which is growing inequality, but I'd actually ask you to focus on the left half of the chart. It is not some sort of physical law of nature or economic law that inequality needs to increase. Look at the fact that in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, the pay of CEOs was growing less quickly than our economy was growing. Inequality is not like gravity. It's a choice that societies make. We used to make a set of choices that caused inequality to fall, that caused poor and working class and middle class people to get bigger raises than rich people. And for the last 4 or 5 decades, we've met an opposite set of choices. This is another piece of research that comes from Opportunity Insights, a group that John is very heavily involved in, helps run. This is your chance of making more money than your parents, depending when you were born. If you were born in 1940, it is a near guarantee, 92%, that you grow up to make more money adjusted for inflation than your parents. If you were born in 1980, it's a coin flip. Just to focus on the 1940 data point for a minute here, think about how many people in that 1940 group had something bad happen to them in their lives. They were laid off. They were laid off more than once. They went through a divorce. They weren't a white, straight Protestant man, which means they suffered horrible discrimination. And yet, despite that, they still grew up to make more money than their parents had made at the same age. Whereas for people born in 1980, it's more akin to a coin flip. Now, all of these economic numbers are complicated. as the economists in the audience know, above all, they rely on what inflation adjustment you use. I promise I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But if you change the inflation adjustment a little bit, you can change these numbers. And if you read the Wall Street Journal, as I do, roughly every 2 weeks, Phil Gramm, the former senator from Texas, writes an op-ed saying, actually, if you use a different inflation adjustment, we're living in the greatest economy in history. I think he's wrong on the merits. But if you're not sure, if you say, wait a second, what if we actually use a slightly different set of economic assumptions? Maybe these economic numbers are better than David is trying to persuade us of. Maybe actually our economy is better than he's saying. I would say, okay, let's set aside economics for a minute. Let's be neutral. Let's be agnostic about what the economics numbers say. And let's think about all of the other data in our society. What has happened to social metrics, like the percentage of Americans who spend time behind bars? What has happened to the percentage of Americans who grow up with two parents? What's happened to the percentage of Americans who suffer chronic pain? What's happened to the percentage of Americans who say they're unhappy or lonely? What's happened to the percentage of Americans who are on disability? All those numbers match these numbers. They don't look good, and they particularly don't look good for Americans who don't have a four-year college degree. Not only that, but when we ask Americans, how are things going in your country, their answer is not well. It has been nearly 20 years since a majority of Americans said our country was headed in the right direction. That's true whether we're in an economic expansion or a recession. It's true whether there's a Democrat or a Republican who's president. And so you think about all of this data, and then you add back the very first slide we looked at, and I think it is clear that in a very basic way, American society and the American economy is not delivering good results for most Americans. Most Americans do not have a four-year college degree. About 60%, 60+% of adults today do not have a four-year college degree. So why is that? I highlight three main forces in the book. Oh, my numbers got changed. There's a joke somewhere in here about being applied math major at Yale. Power, culture, and investment. That's my fault. Power is 1, culture is 2, investment's 3. And as I said, the book is very much a set of stories about these. A. Philip Randolph, if you want me to press play on my 5-minute version of A. Philip Randolph's life during the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. I think A. Philip Randolph is an amazing and inspiring character. He organized the first significant labor union for Black Americans. And one of the reasons I like telling his story is when people say, how can we ever change anything? Aren't we doomed? I would say to you, if A. Philip Randolph didn't give up in 1925 in a society that didn't allow any labor unions pretty much at all, let alone labor unions for Black Americans, if A. Philip Randolph didn't give up, I don't think we should either. Power, by which I chiefly mean political power. Culture, by which I chiefly mean the culture in corporate America. And investment, by which I chiefly, but don't only mean government and federal investment. I'm going to talk very briefly about these three before we go into the discussion. Political power is not all labor unions, but it's a lot about labor unions. And I've been writing about the economy for most of the last 25 years at the New York Times. Writing this book made me realize that I had made a mistake by not paying more attention to the importance of labor unions. I know labor unions are imperfect. I was in a labor union for years. I write about some of my frustrations involving urgent medical care for a member of my family that came from my own labor union. I'm now a manager at the New York Times. I manage people in a labor union. I know they can sometimes be obstacles to change. I know there are particular concerns that many people have about public sector labor unions. I know all this. But in an economy without flawed labor unions, what happens is that flawed corporations set the terms of our economy. And we've been living with that kind of an economy now for decades. Look at this chart. For the last century, when labor unions were growing and strong, inequality was falling. And when labor unions were shrinking, inequality was growing. If you like reading academic papers, I strongly recommend reading this paper that I link to at the bottom by Farber and Herbst and Kuzemko and Naidu. In which they compare otherwise similar workers over many decades and look at what the impact of labor unions are. We saw it again this year when workers at GM and workers in Hollywood won raises that they would not have won without labor unions. I don't think the big three would have given those raises to those workers if they just asked nicely without threatening a strike. Labor unions can overreach, but that's not the dominant experience in this country. The dominant experience is that labor unions shift money that was going to corporate profits and stockholders and executives toward workers. It's not that they make the economy much worse overall. It's that they take from some people and give to others. And when you hear the people who are losing out to labor unions, which tend to be very affluent people, complain so much about labor unions, it's worth asking, they're bad for you, are they bad for our society? They may not be bad for our society. I don't just mean unions by political power, and I'll circle back to that in a minute. I think this is the role of corporate culture, and you've already seen this chart. But again, focus on the left half of this and ask yourself, why is it that CEOs didn't make nearly as much money and received such smaller raises in the 50s and 60s today? I think some of it really is about our culture in society. Then, as now, CEOs often had boards who were their very dear friends. Then, as now, executives could have insisted on making more money than they did. They didn't insist on it. When Dwight Eisenhower became president of the United States in 1953, the first Republican in 20 years, very much the candidate of corporate America. After Dwight Eisenhower won, do you know where he went and spent 2 weeks in order to pick his cabinet? Augusta National Golf Club. He spent 2 weeks at the golf club that hosts the Masters, surrounded by CEOs, and picked mostly other CEOs to fill out his government. This was the first Republican administration that was taking power in 20 years. The top marginal tax rate at the time was 90%. Did Dwight Eisenhower and his corporate friends in the administration attempt to reduce the top marginal tax rate of 90%? No, they did not. Whether that was a good decision or a bad decision, it reflected a very different culture than we have today. They could have pushed to reduce that tax rate. They could have paid themselves more than they have, and they didn't. And I think it's worth reflecting on how we had a culture at the time that was more patriotic and more communitarian and frankly less selfish than our corporate culture is today. I tell the story of the Romneys in this book because I think both George Romney and Mitt Romney are deeply admirable people, whether you agree with them or disagree with them. I think they both care about their country. I think they both care about their community. They're remarkably similar. They both were business executives who became very successful. Then they entered politics. Then they got elected governor. They were willing to defy their party, the Republican Party, in a way that most other Republicans weren't. They ran for president and they lost. They even look remarkably similar. I happened to have a meeting with Mitt Romney while I was writing the chapter about George Romney during this book, and I almost gasped when Mitt Romney walked in the room because I'd just spent weeks looking at photos of George Romney when he was almost the same age that Mitt Romney is now, and I felt like George Romney had just walked in the room. They're incredibly similar. When George Romney hit every single financial target that his company, American Motors, had set for him, he was due a bonus that would have taken his pay over $225,000 a year, which is a few $1 million in today's dollar. He didn't believe that anyone should make that much money. He thought it was obscene. He didn't want to have a big gap between him and his workers. So he went to his board, which was run by one of his very closest friends, J. Willard Marriott, and he said, I don't think I should have this money. Are you willing to take my bonus back? And the board took his bonus back. As I've told you, I think Mitt Romney, his son, is a deeply honorable person in many ways. Mitt Romney never went to Bain and said, I find this amount of money you're paying me obscene, please take it back. And he was making many multiples of what his dad made. The difference isn't in what kind of person George and Mitt are. The difference is the kind of culture they were both operating in. And I think we have a much more selfish culture in corporate America today than we used to. And universities like this university are affected in the career choices that many people make by that culture, and that's worth reflecting on a little bit. The final force that I talk about is investment. This is federal spending on R&D as a share of GDP. Joe Biden has mentioned this statistic In his speeches, he said we used to spend almost 2% of GDP on research and development. Now we're down to 0.7. I would love to believe that Joe Biden had just read my book on his way out to give that speech. I don't think that's the case. This comes from work of John Gruber and Simon Johnson at MIT. I'm guessing Biden's advisors got it from the same place I did. But this is a really striking chart, and you'll notice that I've shaded Eisenhower's presidency to make clear that in order to believe in research and development, you don't have to be some sort of communist. Republican president led this huge increase in research and development. And while the private sector plays a central role in research and development, there are many forms of investment that if the public sector doesn't make, no one will make. The early computer industry is a great example. IBM didn't do it because it would have threatened its punch card business. So it didn't invest in inventing this big new computer. Often companies can't know how they will profit from an investment. So the government needs to underwrite basic research that turns into great things that the private sector can then take over. We used to do much more of this. We used to spend much more of our government dollars focused on the future and less of it focused on the present than we now do. Joe Biden, to his great credit, has passed a whole bunch of research, legislation, some of it bipartisan, that is aimed at exactly this problem. By investment, I don't just mean R&D. I also mean the kinds of programs we spend on. This chart is missing a one more line that would be consistent with it, which is Social Security and other income support programs, which look a lot like the healthcare line, which is just they go up, up, up. And I'm not saying that we should not spend on healthcare or Social Security or anti-poverty. Those are all very important programs. They're also not investments in the future for the most part. Education is an investment in the future. R&D is an investment in the future. Transportation is an investment in the future. And if you're tempted to say this is all because we spend so much on the military, it's not. Look at the chart. We actually have really reduced our military spending. And strangely, a whole bunch of military spending ends up being an investment in the future. As I'm sure some of you know, the Defense Department built the original internet. The Defense Department essentially was behind all of the early investments in computer science. So as a society, we just aren't as good at investing in the future as we used to be. The story that I tell in the book is, imagine you woke up this morning, I'll make it Boston here, in Boston, and you wanted to get to LA. It would take you longer to make that trip today than it would have 50 years ago. That, like the life expectancy data, I think is a remarkable sign of stagnation in our society. Why would it take you longer? Because you would have more traffic in Boston on your way to the airport. Maybe Boston is the exception because of the big dig. But you would have more traffic to the airport than you would have 50 years ago. You have to get to the airport 2 hours early, which you did not 50 years ago. So you can take off your shoes and go through the security line. The scheduled flight time from one coast to the other is about a half hour longer than it was 50 years ago. Isn't that remarkable? The scheduled flight time is a half hour longer than it was 50 years ago because our technology has not made planes much faster and the skies are more crowded, so they have to leave time to avoid traffic. Then you'd land in LA and you'd sit in traffic in LA. This is not because we've hit some limit of how fast human beings can travel. In other countries, travel has sped up. I would guess some of you have been to Shanghai. If you have, maybe you've taken the same train that I have that took you from downtown Shanghai to the Shanghai airport in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Downtown Shanghai and the Shanghai airport are further apart than Times Square and LaGuardia Airport. I challenge you to make it from Times Square to LaGuardia Airport. Forget about 8. Try 18. You'll fail at both of those. In the middle of the night, you can do 28. It's true also in much of Europe. They've built new trains that get people around faster in different ways. And so to me, that's a real sign of our lack of investment in the future. I nonetheless think, despite all these problems, that we have a political system that has the ability to fix many of our problems. My last chapter is surprisingly optimistic for the story I've just told you. And that's because I think that grassroots politics actually have a glorious and incredibly successful history over not just the last century, but the last 50 years. The civil rights movement, which meaningfully changed the lives of many people in this room, and if you think about your friends and your family, probably everyone in this room, was a grassroots movement that changed this country. The women's rights movement was a grassroots movement that changed the country. The disability rights movement was a grassroots movement that changed the country. In the living memory of people in this room, there were children who could not go to public school because they were disabled. A grassroots movement changed that and ended that injustice. And those are all somewhat old movements. Those are older than any undergraduates sitting here today. But I can give you examples that are much more recent. If I were here 25 years ago, I would not have predicted, and I'm guessing most of you would not have predicted, that marriage equality would happen nearly as rapidly as it happened. That was a grassroots movement that made that happen. If you are conservative, and I know this example is going to make some people uncomfortable, when the Supreme Court passed Roe v. Wade 50 years ago, conservatives didn't say the system is rigged, we can never change it, we're doomed, the liberals control everything. They started a grassroots movement. They took over the Republican Party, they won local elections, and even though they never had 51% of Americans on their side, they used a grassroots movement to change the laws in this country. I really believe that grassroots movements, like the labor movement a century ago, like all the movements I just named, have the ability to change our country and to improve lives for most people and to fix many of these problems we've talked about. I think the fundamental problem is we have not had grassroots movements focused on the living standards of ordinary Americans. I think the Republican Party is still enthralled to an economic ideology that hasn't worked. It's not an accident that so many of these trends I've sketched out tonight started turning dark in around 1980. In around 1980, the United States made a sharper turn toward laissez-faire economics than almost any other country in the world. When we made that turn, the advocates for us promised it wouldn't just be good for rich people, they promised it would be good for everyone. You can go back and read the promises. I've repeated them in chapter 8 if you want a handy guide to them. And they were wrong about that. The economy the last 50 years has not been good for ordinary people. And I also spend a fair amount of time criticizing the left half of the political spectrum in the Democratic Party in this book. I believe the left half of the political spectrum has alienated huge numbers of Americans, including most Americans who do not have a four-year college degree. And I believe that the left in this country is not nearly reflective enough on that, for that failure, for those failures. For a long time, Democrats and the left said that's because they're all racist. That's because they're all ignorant. That's because they're all hateful. We can't compromise with them. We have to just beat them. I think that was wrong in the moment. I think it's very clearly wrong today when we've had 5 years in which there has been a significant shift of Latino Americans toward the political right, a significant shift of Asian Americans toward the political right, and a shift of a couple of percentage points of Black Americans away from the Democratic Party and toward the Republican Party. In all of those groups, the shift to the right is more likely to be among people who don't have a four-year college degree. And I wish the political left, which has such a proud, glorious history of speaking for vulnerable people, were more reflective about the fact that actually people who tend to be vulnerable today feel deeply alienated from the Democratic Party. Whether it's on COVID lockdowns, whether it's on immigration policy, whether it's on religion, whether it's on patriotism, whether it's on any number of issues, working class Americans look at the Democratic Party and say, that doesn't reflect my values. And I think Democrats don't spend nearly enough time thinking about how they can win more of those votes and be more respectful of working class Americans, and too much time blaming working class Americans for their own plight. This chart shows the switch in our parties. On the left side, you see the fact, all those bars pointing down on the very left show that college-educated voters used to be more Republican than the rest of the US. And then you can see in the last few elections, college-educated voters have become more Democratic than the rest of the country. That's why those bars are up. And the trends are even bigger among people who don't have a four-year college degree. They are heavily, heavily Democratic in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s. Today, they are strongly Republican. I've reached my half hour. I'm guessing some people disagree with the last few minutes of this talk, but we can get to that in Q&A, and I'm happy to come in to some of the last couple charts. I do want to end, before we go into that, with just emphasizing that I know I'm sort of an optimistic person by nature, and there are times where I grappled with, am I really ending on an optimistic note just because it's sort of how I'm built? I really don't think it is. I really do think with all of the deep challenges that we face, including the real risk of an authoritarian government taking office in this country in less than a year, I really do believe that our system still has the ability to fix much of what ails us as a country. It's not just the big examples I gave. It's even the rare movements that have been devoted to the living standards of working class people that have succeeded in this country recently. Donald Trump had the votes to repeal Obamacare, and a grassroots movement rose up and kept him from doing so, centered very much on the disability rights movement, by the way. In red and in purple states, people have voted for increases in the minimum wage, and they voted for expansions in healthcare. I think if we could get past some of these deeply divisive social issue debates in which the Democratic Party has alienated huge numbers of working class people, I do think there is a majority for a more broadly prosperous country and a more progressive economy that would serve more people better than our current economy does. I don't think that's just wishful thinking. I think there's huge evidence that our political system can respond to people's needs when we actually find ways to build coalitions that work. And I will end by returning to the success of the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement won its victories not by making its opponents feel small or ignorant or hateful. The gay rights movement won its victory with an incredibly savvy, a ruthlessly savvy approach in which they picked two issues to win over Americans who aren't already won over to what they were arguing. They picked the military. They said, let us serve in the military just like straight people can serve in the military. And they picked marriage. They said, let us be married just the way other people can be married. That's the kind of political movement I'm talking about. It takes the idea of persuasion seriously. It takes the idea of respecting people with whom you disagree seriously. And it tries to win them over and build a coalition that can actually change the country. And when you think about what the gay rights movement has accomplished and how it has meaningfully changed the lives of all of us in different ways, I really do think it is a model for building a better economy for our country. Thank you all so much for coming.
David, thank you so much. I am going to mostly moderate a discussion, and so I'm going to limit myself I'm going to try just to 2 questions, and then open the floor, and you'll see we have mics set up here so that all of you can ask this question. And just 2 is really hard because he's very interesting, right? There's a lot here that I would love to ask you about. So thank you so much for that talk. And thank you so much for the book. I don't think this isn't my copy. I wanted to bring up my copy as a prop because
it might be.
The one that I have, it does, has dog-eared pages all the way through as I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, and I learned something there too. And so I really got a lot out of this book. So thank you. You talked about 3 major things: power, culture, and investment.
Yes.
I find all 3 of them compelling. But the one I want to talk about is investment.
Yes.
And in the book, it's really quite striking how you show that not only are we underinvesting today in terms of public investment, but we used to invest quite a lot, and the results were magnificent on your telling. And for somebody who thinks about climate change a lot in my day job, the idea that companies like IBM might not invest in inventing the computer because they're interested in their current business of punch cards is something that that resonates with me, and very much I very much worry about today's incumbent energy companies, right? So very, very powerful story there. So take us from where you ended in the conclusion about the grassroots movement to how do we as a society, as voters, as citizens, think about giving the right signals, the right incentives to our leaders, political and otherwise, to generate that kind of investment again to help us reverse some of these trends that you've shown?
I wish the relationship were closer between doing the right thing economically and being rewarded politically. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that President Biden appears to have gotten no lift in Ohio despite the semiconductor plants that have opened there. And I think Biden's investment agenda is really quite good, right? I mean, he has spent a whole lot of money on exactly the things that that I think history suggests the government needs to do. Some of those things are going to fail, some of those investments. That's fine, right? The successes tend to more than pay for the failures as long as you have like a rigorous process and you make sure that it's not political connections deciding who's going to get the money. But it's really hard because these things often take decades to pay off, and we live in an incredibly polarized society. And so I think, to me, investment is one of these things in which grassroots politics needs to push us in roughly the right direction. If we had a stronger labor movement, I think it would lead to governments who were more likely to put in place long-term investments. But I don't think it's that easy to organize grassroots movements over large-scale investments. I actually think that's an area where we need to persuade elites, people who are going to be in staff jobs in Washington, that this is really important. And the good news is, to some extent, that's happened. I mean, the people who have filled Joe Biden's administration are meaningfully different in their approach to past Democratic policy aids. There's a great chapter in a new book called The Last Politician by Frank Foer about President Biden's first 2 years. Full disclosure, Frank and I happened to write our book at the same coffee shop in Washington and would take 20-minute breaks almost every day to talk to each other. But we didn't really know each other before that. And Frank has a lovely chapter about Jake Sullivan, who is not only the national security advisor, but an important Biden advisor. Basically how Jake Sullivan kind of turned away from some of the market-oriented centrism that Democrats had in the 80s and 90s because he thought it hadn't delivered what it promised. And so I think that helps explain why Biden is doing more of this investment stuff, that a significant number of Democratic and Democratic-aligned aides have looked at history and said, you know what, a bunch of the stuff we did in the 20th century, actually mid-20th century, worked better. And climate is by far the most important one because not only can it have the economic benefits, but it can also save our planet.
That seems like a fairly good side benefit.
Yes.
Well. Okay, so my second question then of two is I have to ask the sort of the media question, which unfortunately you'll probably get all too often and sick of. But I'm struck in particular about the charts that you showed on inequality, on CEO pay, and on other parts of inequality in our society. And what do you think the media's role, can be or should be in shining a light on that and helping us think through how to process that inequality in our society?
We, in many ways, we have suffered from some of the same problems that I described about our two political parties. So the people who write your so-called mainstream media news are substantially more affluent than the average American, right? We're not hedge fund people, but some people in TV make hedge fund-like money, but most of us are not. But we also are really much better off than the average American. And so of all the forms of bias that we talk about in the media, I do think affluence bias is a real form of bias. I mean, you'll sometimes hear at major newspapers with which I'm familiar, someone saying something like, well, I don't even understand how people can live in New York City on less than $150,000. Well, most people are living in New York on a lot less than $150,000, right? And so I do think it colors our coverage in a whole bunch of ways. And it is also the case on the other half of this coin that most of us come from places that are not representative of this country politically. You heard where I went to college. I live in Bethesda. Those places do not look like America in terms of people's political views. And so I think to a whole bunch of stories, we bring assumptions that many Americans find as off-putting as some of the things that I described. We treat immigration policy as if obviously we should have more immigration. Well, I don't think it's obvious. And most Americans really don't think it's obvious, right? And so I think there are a whole bunch of ways in which we just signal to readers, we're not for you, we don't really respect your views. And I think we should do a better job of thinking about that. A term I use in the book is Thomas Piketty, the French economist term, the Brahmin left, the upscale left. And I think many of us in media are part of the Brahmin left, and we should grapple with that.
Terrific. I have more. I'll just keep going if you're willing, but I'm happy to call on folks. And what I would ask is that you come up and take one of the mics. And so I will ask one person now to start, but the rest of you who had hands up, if you would just form a queue, that would be terrific. Please.
I actually speak loudly for a living, but
And tell us your name, too.
Rachel Friedberg. So you've spoken really compellingly about changes in the sorts of choices and priorities that we have as a society. In the background, though, are also things which we don't have control over, which have changed over that period of time, especially for those without a college degree. I'm thinking about international trade and skill-biased technological change. Could you speak a little bit about how you see the relative importance of those different factors in affecting whether we can, get back to the good old days at the beginning of your charts?
So technological changes, there's a great book by Claudia Golden, who's the most recent Nobel laureate in economics, and Larry Katz, who, for any economist in the room, Larry Katz and Claudia Golden have been co-authors for years. Claudia and Larry, Larry and Claudia. The Wall Street Journal just did a story that compared them, I kid you not, to Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. because Larry Katz is this phenomenally successful, renowned economist, but he's married to a Nobel Prize winner and he doesn't have a Nobel Prize. So Larry Katz is the Travis Kelce of the relationship. In any event, one of the things that Claudia and Larry point out is that technological change is not new. It didn't start in 1980. And in fact, technological change has often been going on. We can even debate whether it's been more rapid recently than it was in the past. Just think about the technological change that happened in our society from 1930 to 1980. I mean, in many ways, daily life changed a lot more between 1930 and 1980 than it did between 1980 and today, and yet inequality was falling. So technological change is a constant, not necessarily always at the same rate, but it's always going on. And the question is, what do we do in response to it? Do we have rising educational attainment that allows people to grapple better, to deal better with complex jobs? If you're over 65, you're part of the most, an American, you're part of the most educated generation in the world. And if you're younger than 65 and an American, you're not, right? And that's an example of something we could have done that differently to keep up with technological change. I think global trade is a really tough issue because I really do think a lot of the promises of global trade haven't come true, right? We were sold global trade on the idea that it would make us rich and China free. And that kind of hasn't worked out. And so I think global trade is one of those things that we assumed either was unavoidable or good for a long time. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think, again, I'm happy to say lots of negative things about President Biden too, but I think he also deserves credit for expressing more skepticism about global trade than previous Democrats did, and doing so in a more coherent way than Donald Trump did. And so I don't think we can change technology. I don't think we can really stop technological change. I do think we can dial up and down global trade more than we've acknowledged so far.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi there. My name is Evan. I'm a first year. I want to ask you a little bit about the culture side of things. So you talked a little bit about like that culture of selfishness in corporate America.
Yes.
And then also the division between college-educated and non-college-educated Americans. And I'm, as an undergraduate, we're kind of thinking about not just what kind of job do I want to have, but what kind of person do I want to be.
Yes.
And so what do you think is the role of the university and the role of the undergraduate student in not being that?
That's a great question. I think some of these incentives actually align quite nicely. I'm not saying all of them. But I think a lot of universities like Brown have they haven't always created the infrastructures, but they've allowed infrastructures to pop up that funnel people into a relatively narrow set of jobs, often very well-paying jobs. And I don't think there's anything wrong with those jobs. I do think more people are going into them than actually want to go into them, based on what their true interests are. And so I wish universities would do a little bit more to make it possible for people to think more broadly about what jobs to do and have those easily accessible. And given that they're not, I would encourage you all to push back against the conveyor belt that you're going to be put on to be moved toward a relatively few number of careers afterwards. There's a good chance you don't actually want to do one of those careers, and you're going to be a little bit bored. And I was 20 once, and I'm 51 now, and if I could go back and tell my friends when I was 20-something, two things about jobs. I would say, one, focus more on what will allow you to have the family life that you want than you are at age 20, because you can't really think about that at 20. And it's incredibly important to having a happy life. Having a job where you can, if you want, spend a lot of time with your family and build your job around your family. And the other thing is, even if you make a lot of money, if you go off and make like $100 million, maybe it doesn't matter if you don't like your job. But you can make a lot of money and not like your job, and it's pretty unpleasant. And I've seen a fair number of people in that situation. And I would just encourage you, think about what you actually want to do, and even if it takes more work, go do it. Praising one's spouse is not the most original thing to do, but I'm going to do it. My wife is wonderfully stubborn. And when she went to law school, and she said, I want to go into nonprofit law, and everyone said to her, well, you first have to get a job at a law firm. She said, no, I don't. And she applied only for jobs in nonprofit law. And it was a lot harder than it would have been for her to get a job for a law firm. And it's kind of crazy that she had to work a lot harder to get a lower paying job. And she got one, and she liked it. And there are versions of that as you think about what you're going to do beyond here that I would encourage you to do.
Thank you.
Alex, I want to make sure
good.
that we're getting a recording of this message for my next conversation at the Career Center on campus, because I have many of them.
Next time we'll have Laura, my wife, come, and she'll deliver it better than me.
Terrific. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anya Bassett. I'm the faculty director of the undergraduate concentration here at IAPA, and really appreciate your answer to that as well. So you and I are about the same age. You said you're 51. I will be 56 next week, and I graduated from college in 1990. And in the fall of my senior year, the Berlin Wall fell down. In 2 months after I graduated, the ADA was passed. And in the spring of my senior year, my thesis advisor invited me to a baby shower for a baby that she was having with a woman she could not marry. And neither of us, as you pointed out, could have imagined that 25 years later, marriage would be the law of the land. So our experience, our generational experience, is to see some of that progress. And my current students, I teach a course on inequality in America, don't see that as clearly. They remember, some of them remember the 2008 financial crisis, they remember Trump's election, they remember the pandemic. They don't have, and the example of Dobbs is not necessarily an inspiration to them, as you pointed out. What do you say to them? How do you help them to see the long game? And how do you help them to have hope in grassroots when it hasn't worked very well for the left recently?
I still think some of the changes that have happened, like same-sex marriage, are recent enough that they can serve as an inspiration. The labor union, the rise of the labor union, serves as an inspiration to me. I was born in 1973 and have lived only in a society where labor unions were basically being crushed. So I think history is really important, and so I would encourage people to read the history of the gay rights movement or the disability rights movement or the labor movement. But I still think there have been examples of progress in the last decade or two. I've used the phrase gay rights, but I could have used the phrase LGBT rights, and there's been meaningful progress. I understand people are worried about backsliding, but there's been meaningful progress in the last decade in that. I mentioned the passage of minimum wage laws in a whole bunch of states. There are millions of people who are making more money today because a red state passed a minimum wage law. There are millions of people who have health insurance because Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and a whole bunch of other people made sure that that law got passed. And then when it was under threat only 4 years ago, 7 years ago, it was 7 years ago, that movement was defeated. And so I understand why people feel really worried and anxious, but I do still think there are examples of progress in our living lifetime. And then I guess there's also, what else are we going to do? Are we going to give up, right? And I guess I would argue no. Like, let's fight for something better.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is. Oh,
No, please.
okay. Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a first year here, and you mentioned the role of the labor union and kind of the decline in it like over the past few decades. This question kind of has two parts. First, in 2022, there was a strike at the New York Times, and you said you're a manager, not a union member. What kind of, how did you bring your own approach and views on unions to kind of engaging with strikers and labor negotiations at the Times? Because these are a bunch of college-educated workers,
Yep.
but it's still, as we saw, like this was a historic strike for a newsroom. And like, what lessons kind of did you take away from that into your approach for unions for non-college educated workers, or the outlook for organized labor in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Good, tough question. So there was a one-day work stoppage. There was never a strike. The union and management signed a contract before there was a strike, but there was a one-day work stoppage. And there was a lot of noise and protest around it. Look, I think that's another example of the power of unions. My unionized colleagues would not have gotten as big raises as they got if they didn't have a labor union. They wouldn't have gotten the raises they got without that one-day work stoppage and without a lot of the noise that they made. I mean, I can't say it was definitely this work stoppage or that noise, but they wouldn't have gotten the raises they got without the power of collective bargaining. And so I think it's an example of how important that it is. In the big picture, I don't think that having relatively well-paid employees of the New York Times or other magazines, or having graduate students organize, is actually what really matters for creating a more equal, more decent economy. Most of the people in those situations are going to do fine. I'm still in favor of even relatively privileged workers having collective bargaining rights. But if we try to step back and look at the larger societal importance, the reason I think those things matter is that people who are in relatively elite and influential places like Brown University, like the New York Times, now spend a lot of time hearing about labor unions in a way that I, as a child of the 1980s, kind of didn't hear that much about labor unions, except to hear about how they were losing and shrinking and going away. And so the fact that in all these different realms, people are hearing about labor unions and they seem important, a lot of the people who are hearing about a graduate student union or hearing about Dartmouth athletes organizing, which I'm not even sure how I think about that, those people are going to go off and work in the Senate and work at think tanks, and the idea that unions matter is going to be important to them. So from the standpoint of society, I actually think that's the bigger deal about the New York Times stuff, because people at the New York Times now think about unions in different ways, although I'm also glad that my unionized colleagues got good raises.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm Michael Kramer. I'm a faculty spouse as well as a retired lawyer. The working class voters have, since the Reagan elections, voted often, if not consistently, against what should be their own economic self-interest. And President Biden is talking about his Scranton roots over and over again, is trying to somehow counter that. But the marketing the Democrats have had on that subject have completely failed, and working class voters still generally vote against their self-interest. Is this simply a question of marketing? What can be done about that, if anything?
This is one of my absolute favorite subjects.
You're welcome.
So thank you. And I think if you read the morning newsletter that I write, I just wrote a short thing about RFK and the Tom Suozzi election this week. that was a tiny little excerpt of the story of the 1968 campaign that I tell in the book. So I think the frame that I think you have accurately described the way the Democratic Party thinks about this, and I think they're thinking about it wrong. So the other people who vote against their economic interests are rich people who vote Democratic, right? Aspen, Colorado, strongly Democratic. Martha's Vineyard, strongly Democratic. You name the fancy resort, strongly Democratic. Jackson Hole. Go to the wealthiest suburbs of Boston and New York and San Francisco. All these places are voting for tax increases on themselves, and they're voting for increased benefits for people who aren't them. I don't think that's irrational. I think it's perfectly rational to decide that you're going to vote on climate change, or vote on abortion, or vote on any number of other issues that are not economic. And I think what the Democratic Party has often done is they've said to working class voters, please ignore all of our positions on these social issues and pay attention only to our economic positions. And I don't think that's respectful of those voters. And so I think the winning more working class voters has to involve taking seriously and respectfully their views on non-economic issues. And the part of my talk that I skipped at the end just to get to this was somewhat focused on immigration. If you read the Democratic Party's platform on immigration from 2020, it is not in favor of open borders, but every single sentence is in favor of more open borders. This is a relatively radical change in a very short period of time. Barack Obama was very strongly in favor of border security. Bill Clinton was very strongly in favor of border security. Civil rights organizers like Barbara Jordan and A. Philip Randolph, labor union organizers were very strongly in favor of border security. Bernie Sanders said less than a decade ago, why do you think all these CEOs are in favor of comprehensive immigration reform that would lead to much higher levels of immigration? Do you think it's because they're concerned about the undocumented? I don't. I think it's because they want low wages. Now, we can have a whole debate about the economic research about what immigration shows. But I think if the Democratic Party is going to say, we are basically against any additional form of border security, we want much higher levels of undocumented immigration, which is how Joe Biden is governed, I think it's completely reasonable for working class people in Arizona or Texas to say, that's not the party we want, even if the party is in favor of larger benefits for working class people. And so that's just one example. COVID lockdowns are another example. I think on a whole set of issues, the Democratic Party hasn't engaged with working class people on all these other issues. And it isn't enough to just say, ignore our position on them and pay attention to us on economics. I think they have to engage with Democrats on these other issues. And that's why Robert F. Kennedy is a hero in my book. We all remember him as a liberal hero. He did engage with working class people's views on a whole bunch of issues. And if you lived through the 1968 campaign, you may remember this. If you didn't, I have the quotes in my book. Liberals were really angry at him during the campaign because he engaged with working class people on crime and on Vietnam. Instead of just saying, ignore my positions on these things, let's talk about economic policy. And I think there's a real lesson there for Democrats.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I come from a purple state and a purple family, the kind of city-educated part of North Carolina. And my relatives who are on the right, they learned to dislike and distrust, particularly the New York Times, by watching Fox News.
Yeah.
And it pretty much, their opinions are coming from Fox News. And so I really like the previous question because it's all about content and substance, but I'm also interested in asking about the media and its role. And given that we have, freedom of the press, how do we counteract these strong messaging incentives that are always, partisan?
Yeah. I thought you were going to say they learned to hate the New York Times by reading the New York Times. So I was actually, I was pleased by your description.
No, they learn it from Fox News.
Yes. Yeah. Look, Fox News is a big problem. It's a big problem in our society, right? It is a major media outlet that isn't just partisan, but regularly spreads false information. And if we look at none of us in the media are perfect. We all make mistakes. We all sometimes report things that turn out not to be true. But that's different from deliberately spreading false information. And there's all kinds of evidence that Fox News deliberately spreads false information. You can look at how it covered Barack Obama's birthplace, right? You can look at how it covered the 2020 election, although it's been on both sides of the 2020 election. So it's a real issue. And I don't have, because we do live in a country that believes in free speech and believes in capitalism, I don't have a particularly easy answer to the Fox News problem. I do think the only plausible answer is for other media sources to do their best to counter it by both telling the truth and also being respectful of the people in those purple places that you mentioned. And I don't think all those of us in the media always are respectful of people in other areas. I think when you look at, we in the media writ large, do sometimes cover immigration in a way in which if you're in favor of more immigration, you're enlightened. And if you're not, you're ignorant or hateful. And I think that's going to turn people off. And I think we really should think about the way we cover things and ask ourselves, are we writing about it in a way that is a little bit humble about what is actually right and what we know, and is respectful of the views that our audience has?
So I'm going to take a couple more questions because we have time, but you've been such a good sport about introspection on the media that before we end, I'd love to give you a chance to sort of flip the tables and talk a little bit about what higher education, or Brown University specifically, should be thinking about in terms of its role in our society.
I will make sure to do that once we, yeah,
absolutely. So I think you were up for, oh, I got it wrong.
Okay,
Please.
great. David, Jennifer Nuzzo, Director of the Brown Pandemic Center. Really, it's been great to talk to you over these years about COVID. And although that wasn't the focus of your talk, that first picture that you shows that stunning decrease in life expectancy that we saw during the pandemic. We've seen a little bit of a small recovery in life expectancy, but I'm curious on all of the trends that you're talking about, your thoughts, because you've really worked at these intersection of these issues. Where do you see the trends? What do you think that the pandemic's ultimate reach will be in terms of these other trends? I know we've talked a lot about education and other things. That little kind of bump in life expectancy that we saw last year was, I think not particularly heartwarming, given how much of a decline it was. But where do you see the other trends going? And as a result of the pandemic, I think it's really important for us to be documenting what the ultimate tolls of that event was, not just the very obvious, health metrics, but all of the other societal impacts that the pandemic has had.
Yes. So as I got to do with John before, this is an opportunity. I get to say thank you to Jennifer. This may get you in trouble, but no one was more important in educating me about COVID than Jennifer was. And she deserves no responsibility for any of the things that I wrote. But we started talking when she was at Johns Hopkins, and Brown was incredibly lucky to get you here. So thank you. I think about that in a whole bunch of ways, and they're almost all worrisome. And as at this point, you probably know, I keep trying to find like silver linings. I'm not sure I have one on COVID, right? So there is the direct costs of COVID, just how many people it killed, how many people even though we don't understand long COVID well at all. Obviously it's real, and how many people it gave really significant problems to. I also really worry about how it increased distrust of vaccines overall, right? I mean, you look at how that became such a partisan debate, and it's just really remarkable and terrible what it's done to vaccination rates on other things. And then there are all the other things that are even less direct than vaccination. I think there are a whole bunch of ways in which our society is still broken from COVID and we haven't recovered. If you're a professor, I'm guessing, because I've heard this from many professors, that your in-class attendance still has not returned to pre-COVID levels. I've heard this from many professors. if you work in volunteers at a public school, you will notice that there are not as many volunteers as there used to be. If you work at an organization, you don't spend as much time interacting with people face to face, and it is much easier for conflicts to quickly get really nasty when you're not face to face with each other. Face to face, we can be like, hey, I disagree with you, but I still think you're a good person, or we can kind of send that thing. The Times had a famous blow up in the summer of 2020 in which one of our top editors was fired. I am convinced it would have unfolded differently if we had all been in the office rather than over Zoom. I recently looked at some photos of some sporting events at the high school in my community. This isn't why I was looking at them. Attendance was higher 5 years ago than it is now. I take the subway constantly in Washington. I never used to see people jumping turnstiles. I think I see someone jumping a turnstile every day I take the Washington Metro. I'm not saying that's because of COVID per se, but basically all kinds of things broke in that 20 and 2022 period. So to answer your question directly, I really hope that we can do some sort of broad look, whether COVID was responsible or not, some broad look at the things that in some basic way deteriorated in terms of our social fabric and come up with ways to address them. And I haven't even mentioned learning loss for kids, which is probably the single biggest way in which our social fabric has deteriorated. I lived in New York on 9/11. My wife was getting out of the subway at Ground Zero when it happened. I am not in any way dismissive of how horrible 9/11 was. Life in this country was back to normal, even in New York, with the exception of the people who were killed and with the exception of airport security almost immediately. COVID is such a more profound change in our lives than something that we thought was going to be the biggest change. And I just think we have to keep remembering how much it robbed us of and get back as much as we can.
Thanks. I'm David Weil, a professor in the economics department. I want to be a little mischievous and talk about the overlap between what you're talking about in this book and Jeff Colgan's interests in climate change, because these are both things that I study and I teach to some extent. I was surprised to see you sort of agreeing so readily with each other, because my sort of understanding was that almost everything that's important to fighting climate change is bad for inequality in the United States. So sort of, the simple examples would be the destruction of the coal mining industry, which when Hillary Clinton was asked about it, she basically said, yes, those people have to lose their jobs and we should help them. And that was a politically terrible thing to do. We know that there have to be higher gas taxes or higher prices for gas, and that's bad for rural populations, who are a lot of the case-and-Deaton people who you're looking at who are suffering low life expectancy. And then finally, most recently, it jumped out to me in the paper a few months ago, the United Auto Workers is coming out strongly against electric cars because they provide fewer assembly jobs. And this is a real constraint on our ability to have a policy to reduce fossil fuel emissions. So I just kind of want to toss it at the two of you. Like, am I right that this is kind of something where the preferences of the left-wing Brahmins, which I'm certainly guilty of being, in saving the planet, really are counter to the interests of the working class in America?
We were just talking about this before. So look, I do think there are some tensions there. The UAW's attitude toward electric cars is complicated, right? It's not just negative. It's complicated, and so they're not just standing in the way of electric cars. They just want to make sure that they also have jobs. I think the way in which maybe there are two pieces of bad news that add up to maybe some good news is we don't have higher gas taxes. And the reason we don't, and I don't see us having them anytime soon, and the reason we don't is they're politically toxic, right? And it's not just in the US, right? Like when gas taxes have been passed in other countries, they've sometimes been rolled back, right? There's the British Columbia example, and is there Australia example? There's some examples. And so I actually think that I'm worried we're not doing enough to combat climate change. And I'm worried in part because some of the politics are bad. But actually, what happened is for a long time we were focused on increasing the cost of carbon, which probably would have had some bad inequality effects. But that proved politically impossible. So instead, Joe Biden passed a massive program to invest in clean energy research, which I'm not saying it solves the inequality problem, but I don't think it makes it meaningfully worse, and it might make it a little bit better. Any rebuttal?
I'm just going to add a little bit on, the relationship between green politics and labor, I think are certainly very important, and the degree to which we are running right now a live experiment on the effect of of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most important climate legislation that's ever been passed in this country, and what it means for the elections of the people who passed it. And we don't know, how that's going to play out politically, and there is a whole series of social science questions about credit claiming, about people's beliefs, voters' beliefs around, how they receive the information around the investments that are happening in their communities, whether they view them as positive or negative, whether they associate them with a thing called the Inflation Reduction Act at all. I mean, there's just a whole ton of questions. But the other thing to say on that is that to decarbonize our economy, ultimately, we are going to need to do not one thing, we're going to need to do a whole lot of things, right? There's no silver bullet. At best, the best case scenario is that we have silver buckshot, right? That there's like a whole lot of things that we can do, right? And some of those things will make the problem of inequality potentially worse. Some of them will make it actually better. And what is politically feasible is related to that, but not in a simple way at all. In that, for instance, some of the things that have been tried, like carbon taxes, that are actually progressive, that reduce inequality by providing rebates to lower income households. Sometimes they're politically successful, sometimes they're not. And so that relationship is just, it's much, much harder than we might think of, and sort of like a simple diagram, textbook diagram of how this would work out.
One final side point on that. If you want to see very clear benefits of a version of Democratic Party politics that manages to be respectful of working class people and can get stuff done, the Inflation Reduction Act is an excellent example. It is the most important piece of climate legislation ever passed in our country's history. Do you agree with that?
Arguably the world.
Arguably the world. It doesn't happen without Joe Manchin. West Virginia is a plus 30 Republican state. Democrats can't figure out how to win in North Carolina, which is a plus 5 Republican state. Joe Manchin won in West Virginia and cast one of the absolutely necessary votes for the most important climate legislation ever. And for that to happen, you had to have a Democrat who figured out a way to have West Virginia's voters vote for him. And I'm not saying Joe Manchin's the answer to everything, but having more Democrats who are as smart and savvy and successful as he is, and fewer Democrats who people in places like West Virginia look at and say, ugh, is the solution to things like better climate policy.
Okay, so now we have a terrible choice. We have an additional question, we have 2 minutes, and I promised you something else. So
I'll say something negative about Brown in 30 seconds.
All right.
I'll be very quick.
We'll do one more.
I'll be very quick. I first want to just say thank you very much for coming. I also think that you can't come to radical Brown University and not get a question that's critical of capitalism, so here I go.
Good.
So I guess I just want to ask if those graphs that you had up for your presentation, I'm curious what your response would be to people who look at those and say, these aren't just symptoms of capitalism that you have laid out, but they are kind of the disease of capitalism itself. Curious your thoughts on
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Love that question. I'll do this quickly, I promise. So first of all, I just want to say that, again, I grew up in the 1980s in a very conservative America where even at Radical Brown, you were unlikely to get that question. And I really appreciate that we're now in a time and an era where we can have like intelligent discussions of things like socialism and communism and Marxism. I also grew up in a house where my father was an unreconstructed Marxist. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I think it is a very fair question to look at that and say, well, is capital? These are not byproducts of capitalism. They are the whole problem, and so we need to go to something else. And my answer to that, and I actually spend a fair amount of time on this in the book, is that there is no communist or Marxist system that has done better over any extended period in delivering good living standards to masses of people than capitalism has. There just isn't. And so in my reading. So what explains the difference between the prosperity of South Korea, which is one of the great stories of rising prosperity in the last 70 years, right? And you can still find baseball mitts around garages that say made in Korea because they were a low-wage economy that made things like baseball mitts. You're not going to find that today because of how prosperous South Korea is. Compare that to North Korea. You've probably seen the satellite photos. North Korea is so dark because it's so poor that you can see the difference on satellite photos between South Korea and North Korea. What explains why Cuba is so poor that they can't let people leave? Because everybody would leave. What explains the absolute meltdown in Venezuela in recent years? What explains the fact that China was poor and dysfunctional through the 50s and 60s, and then as it started to introduce more capitalism in the 70s, enjoyed one of the greatest reductions in poverty in human history? So to me, when I look at the evidence, I say that a version of unreconstructed capitalism, like the capitalism we've had over the last 45 or 50 years in this country, works much less well than a version of capitalism that I call democratic capitalism, small d capitalism. But I don't see any evidence that actually a state system, a Marxist system, has ever worked better than a capitalist system has. But I think Marx and Engels had really important critiques of capitalism. My father's not alive anymore. I spent decades debating this with him. I adored him. I completely see the arguments, and I am absolutely glad that we can talk about this now without it seeming like people who raise the really legitimate Marxist and Marxian critiques that they're somehow anti-American, because they're not. So thank you for the question. Brown University should become more Marxist. I recently wrote an article about Duke University, which has the lowest share of students on Pell Grants of any really elite university. Look at the chart. What is second to last on that ranking? It's Brown University. Brown should become more economically diverse. It should admit more students from the lower half of the economic distribution. People will say, well, we don't have as much money here as Princeton does. That is true. That is a weak excuse. There are schools that have a lot less money than Brown does that are more economically diverse. And so this university absolutely could be more economically diverse and do more to foster social mobility than it does. The things that people are doing at Brown are amazing. They transform people's lives. There should be more people here who come from humbler backgrounds, who come from working class backgrounds than there are today. And I would also encourage you all, don't get confused by things that I think are not the same as this debate. I think it is possible for universities to take a hot button issue that I'm just going to drop in here at the end. I think you can reinstate the SAT as a requirement, as Dartmouth just did, and use it to become more economically diverse, not less. Focus on whether the university is actually becoming more economically diverse. Don't focus on some of the kind of bright, shiny objects around that. And I think what's happening here is so amazing that I think it should not, I think more people who didn't grow up with the advantages that I grew up with should be able to get an education here. And I even think that it would help with some of the issues I've been talking about, because when you admit more working class people, you end up realizing that the politics of our country are more complicated than they can seem when you're just having a conversation among relatively well-off progressives.
All right, he's going out throwing punches in every direction. Thank you so much, David, for your talk.
Thank you for having me.